November 23, 1944. The offices of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Technical Intelligence Division occupied a requisitioned building near the Ginza district in Tokyo. Captain Toshio Tsukamoto, a naval engineer with 20 years of service, sat motionless before a stack of photographs spread across his desk. Each image showed the same view: an American shipyard, captured from intelligence sources that Japan's agents still maintained in neutral countries, and through observation of photographs recovered from downed aircraft. What Tsukamoto saw in those images would force him to confront a truth that Japanese military planners had been avoiding since 1941. The photographs showed something far more devastating than any battle report, any tactical defeat, any loss of territory. They showed the ordinary, unglamorous reality of American industrial capacity operating at full mobilization. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The specific images that Tsukamoto examined on that November morning came from a source Japan's intelligence agencies had cultivated carefully throughout the war. Observers in Argentina, Brazil, and other neutral nations who maintained contact with American businessmen, diplomats, and technical specialists. These sources had reported on American shipyard expansion, but the photographs provided concrete evidence that transcended abstract reports. The images showed welders at work in American shipyards, hundreds of them, operating systematically along the hulls of merchant vessels and military transports. Welders moved with practiced efficiency, their equipment arranged with methodical precision. The striking detail, visible even in low-resolution wartime photographs, was the speed and coordination of the work. American shipyards had adopted continuous process welding systems that allowed multiple welders to work simultaneously on different sections of a hull. The flow of labor, the organization of equipment, the evident speed of construction, all pointed to something that Japanese naval planners had discussed theoretically but failed to implement operationally: industrialization of shipbuilding on a scale that exceeded Japanese capability by an order of magnitude. Tsukamoto had been assigned the task of analyzing captured American technical documentation and intelligence reports to assess the feasibility of Japan replicating American shipyard methods. The assignment reflected growing alarm among Japan's naval leadership about one fundamental strategic reality. Japan could not build warships fast enough to replace losses. Throughout 1943 and into 1944, Japanese carriers had been sunk faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The fleet had shrunk from its pre-war composition of 6 large fleet carriers and 5 smaller ones to a force of 3 operational carriers by late 1944. Japan had laid down additional carriers in response to losses, but construction times stretched across 18 months to 2 years per vessel. American shipyards, by contrast, had demonstrated the ability to build Essex-class fleet carriers at a rate of approximately 1 every 6 weeks. Each Essex-class carrier displaced 30,000 tons, measured 870 feet in length, and carried more than 90 aircraft. The construction speed seemed incomprehensible to Japanese engineers. The technical specifications of these American carriers revealed no revolutionary design principles. American carriers did not possess superior armor protection or more efficient propulsion systems than Japanese designs. The difference lay entirely in construction methodology and industrial organization. American shipyards had transformed shipbuilding from a craft practiced by skilled workers to an industrial process where standardization, mass production principles, and continuous flow manufacturing applied. The photographs of American welders represented the visible manifestation of this transformation. Welding, historically performed by individual craftsmen working methodically to achieve specific quality standards, had been reorganized in American shipyards into a high-volume production process. Multiple welding teams worked simultaneously on different sections of a hull. Standardized welding procedures, developed through systematic testing and refinement, ensured consistent quality without requiring the individual judgment of master craftsmen. The continuous nature of the work, the organization of supporting supply chains, and the integration of welding operations into the broader construction sequence all accelerated the timeline from keel laying to launch. Japanese shipyards, by contrast, maintained traditional craft-based construction methods. Master welders supervised the work, ensuring quality through personal oversight. Each weld received individual attention. The process was thorough, producing vessels of excellent quality, but the methodology could not match American production speed. Japan's naval planners understood the disparity in abstract terms through production statistics provided by intelligence agencies. The photographs forced them to confront the reality visually. These were not propaganda images or exaggerated reports. They showed the ordinary operation of American industrial capacity, more devastating in their implications than any military setback. Tsukamoto began his analysis by examining the photographs systematically, estimating the number of welders visible in each image, calculating the linear feet of welds being produced per shift, and extrapolating the monthly production capacity of the specific shipyard photographed. His calculations suggested that the single American shipyard visible in these photographs produced more vessel tonnage annually than the total output of all Japanese shipyards combined. This could not be correct. The numbers must represent significant measurement error or fundamental misunderstanding of the processes shown. Yet, Tsukamoto's mathematical analysis, repeated across multiple photographs from different yards, produced consistent results. The photographs came from several American shipyards on the Pacific coast and in the Gulf of Mexico, the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, the Todd Houston Shipbuilding Company in Texas, the New York Shipbuilding Company in Camden, and others all showed similar patterns of high-speed welded construction. American shipyards had largely abandoned riveting in favor of welding by 1942. This transition, while requiring significant capital investment in equipment and worker retraining, produced construction speed increases of approximately 30 to 40% compared to riveted construction. Welding processes that took a master riveter and his team hours or even days to complete could be accomplished by trained welders in minutes. The cumulative effect across an entire vessel construction timeline was transformative. A merchant vessel that would require 18 to 20 months to build using traditional riveted construction could be completed in 8 to 10 weeks using welded construction, properly organized and equipped. American Liberty ship production exemplified this transformation. At the beginning of the war, constructing a Liberty ship required an average of 220 days of labor hours. By 1943, this had declined to an average of 42 days. The SS Robert E. Peary, launched in 1942, was constructed in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes, an achievement that captured American public imagination and was used for propaganda purposes. However, even accounting for the extraordinary nature of the Peary's construction, standard Liberty ship production times of 6 to 8 weeks represented a more than fourfold acceleration compared to traditional shipbuilding methods. Japan's military planners had access to this information through intelligence reports. They knew the numbers. They understood the implications intellectually. Yet the photographs forced a different kind of comprehension. Numbers on a page could be dismissed as exaggerated. Photographs showing the actual organization of American industrial production could not be so easily rationalized away. Tsukamoto's supervisor, Admiral Shoji Naoi, the head of the Navy's Technical Intelligence Division, recognized the significance of the captain's analysis. In December 1944, Naoi requested a formal briefing to be presented to Japan's Naval General Staff. The presentation would occur on December 15, 1944, in the offices of the Naval General Staff near the Imperial Palace in Tokyo. Senior naval officers, including representatives from the Navy Minister's Office and the Combined Fleet, would attend. The briefing represented an opportunity to force frank discussion of Japan's industrial capacity relative to America's, a conversation that military and political leadership had largely avoided due to its implications for the war's ultimate outcome. Tsukamoto prepared his presentation with meticulous care. He assembled photographs, production statistics from captured American technical journals, and mathematical analyses, demonstrating the disparity in shipyard output between American and Japanese facilities. The evidence was overwhelming and internally consistent. Every analytical approach produced the same conclusion. Japan could not match American production rates under any realistic scenario. The fundamental problem was not Japanese engineering capability. Japanese shipyards could build ships comparable to American designs. Japanese welders, when trained to American standards, could perform welding work as efficiently as their American counterparts. The problem was scale. American industrial mobilization had committed vast resources to shipyard expansion. American shipyards operated around the clock, with 3-shift rotations. American welders worked under wage incentive systems that encouraged speed. American supply chains had been reorganized to deliver materials exactly when needed, eliminating delays and bottlenecks. American management, influenced by Taylor-style efficiency principles and mass production philosophies developed in automobile manufacturing, applied industrial organization techniques that Japanese shipyards had not fully adopted. Japan had committed resources to shipyard expansion during the war, increasing capacity from pre-war levels. However, the expansion had been constrained by the diversion of resources to other military production, by the disruption caused by American bombing of industrial centers, and by the limitations of Japan's overall industrial base. Japan could not commit the raw materials, machine tools, electrical generating capacity, and skilled labor to shipyard expansion at the rate America had done. The strategic context made this disparity even more critical. Japan's fleet strategy depended on the ability to replace combat losses. The Japanese Navy had built warship designs intended for durability and reliability, expecting individual vessels to have long operational lifespans. However, the intensity of naval combat in the Pacific exceeded the assumptions underlying these designs. Aircraft sinkings, submarine attacks, and naval gunfire were destroying ships faster than Japanese production could replace them. American strategy, by contrast, assumed replacement through production. American designs emphasized standardization, mass production compatibility, and rapid construction. When American carriers or battleships were lost, they were replaced through shipyard output that continued accelerating throughout the war. Japan faced a vicious cycle. As losses mounted, psychological pressure to replace them grew. Yet replacement capability could not expand sufficiently to meet losses. The briefing on December 15, 1944, exposed this reality with clinical precision. Tsukamoto presented his photographs, his calculations, and his conclusions to an assembly of Japan's most senior naval officers. The mood in the conference room was somber from the moment the presentation began. The officers present understood what the data signified, even if some had avoided fully confronting it until that moment. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Japan's most perceptive strategist, had been killed in April 1943 when American fighters ambushed his transport aircraft over the Solomon Islands. Yamamoto had understood, from the war's beginning, that Japan lacked the industrial capacity for prolonged conflict with America. He had warned his government in 1941 that he could guarantee vigorous fighting for 6 months, but expressed no confidence regarding a war lasting 2 or 3 years. Yamamoto was gone, but his assessment had proven prophetic. The officers attending Tsukamoto's briefing represented the generation of naval leaders attempting to grapple with the strategic implications of American industrial supremacy. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet since May 1944, listened to the presentation with growing recognition of the strategic catastrophe it represented. Toyoda had been promoted to command the fleet following the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where Japanese naval aviation had been devastated by American carrier aircraft. The battle was so lopsided in American favor that American pilots termed it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan had lost approximately 480 aircraft and 3 carriers in 2 days of combat. American losses were comparatively light. The battle had exposed the reality that Japan could no longer compete in carrier-based naval warfare. Japanese naval aviation, depleted by years of attrition and pilot losses that Japan could not adequately replace, faced American naval aviation flying superior aircraft flown by better-trained pilots, supported by an industrial base that produced replacement aircraft in quantities that dwarfed Japanese production. Toyoda understood that the fleet under his command was gradually being strangled by American industrial capacity. The photographs and calculations presented by Tsukamoto quantified what Toyoda already suspected. Japan was losing a war of production as surely as it was losing tactical engagements at sea. American shipyards were building replacement vessels faster than Japanese industry could produce them. This disparity would only widen as the war progressed. American bombing of Japanese industrial centers was beginning to disrupt production. The capture of the Mariana Islands in July 1944 had placed American strategic bombers within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. B-29 Superfortress bombers were already conducting reconnaissance flights over Japan in preparation for the strategic bombing campaign that would intensify throughout 1945. These bombing raids would further disrupt Japanese industrial production, including shipyard output. The strategic mathematics were brutal and inescapable. If Japan had possessed overwhelming industrial capacity and could replace losses faster than America, the strategic balance would favor Japan despite tactical defeats. Conversely, if America possessed overwhelming industrial capacity and could replace losses faster than Japan, strategic victory would ultimately belong to America, regardless of tactical victories Japan might achieve. The photographs of American welders represented the crystallization of this strategic truth. The speed at which American welders, organized in efficient teams using standardized procedures, could complete hull construction translated directly into fleet replacement rates. Japanese welders, equally skilled and equally dedicated, working under traditional craft-based procedures, could not match this production speed no matter how much effort they expended. The limitation was not human capability or willingness to work. The limitation was organizational and methodological. American industrial organization, developed through decades of mass production experience in automobile and heavy equipment manufacturing, had been applied to shipbuilding with transformative results. Japan's industrial organization, historically grounded in craft production, with individual workers exercising broad discretionary judgment, could not easily or quickly transform to mass production principles. Even if Japan's leadership had decided in December 1944 to revolutionize shipbuilding procedures, adopt continuous flow manufacturing, reorganize welding operations into production teams, and implement Taylor-style efficiency methods, the transformation would require months to implement and would necessarily disrupt existing production to create the conditions for future acceleration. Japan did not have months. The war was approaching a critical phase. American advances in the Pacific were accelerating. The Philippines campaign was underway. Plans for the invasion of Okinawa and ultimately the Japanese home islands were being prepared. Japan's naval forces needed replacement ships immediately, not in 6 months or a year after industrial reorganization could be completed. The briefing concluded with Tsukamoto's frank assessment. Japan could not replicate American shipyard production rates regardless of the effort expended. The photographs of American welders, the calculations of construction timelines, and the strategic implications all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Japan had lost the material contest with America. The war would be decided not in carrier battles or naval engagements, but in the relative industrial capacity of the two nations. America possessed an overwhelming advantage in this domain, an advantage that would only grow as the war continued. The Naval Technical Intelligence Division had maintained detailed records of American shipyard operations since 1942. These records, compiled from captured technical documents, intelligence reports from neutral sources, and analysis of equipment recovered from downed aircraft, revealed patterns that Japanese planners could no longer rationalize or ignore. The specific data that Tsukamoto assembled for his December briefing focused on comparative construction methodologies between American and Japanese shipyards. The differences extended far beyond the visible speed of welding operations. They encompassed the entire organizational philosophy of industrial production. American shipyards had adopted what engineers called flow line or continuous process construction. Vessels moved through the yard on a fixed schedule, with work teams assigned to specific zones completing their tasks as the hull progressed. Materials arrived precisely when needed, staged at assembly points to minimize delays. This eliminated the bottlenecks that plagued traditional shipbuilding, where completion of one phase had to be substantially complete before the next phase could begin. Japanese shipyards, by contrast, maintained the traditional building-in-berth method. The vessel remained stationary throughout construction. Workers and materials came to the ship. This approach allowed more flexibility in design modifications and accommodated the craft-based work methods that characterized Japanese shipbuilding. However, the flexibility came at the cost of efficiency. Complex coordination problems arose when multiple work teams operated on the same vessel simultaneously. The welding operations themselves illustrated this disparity clearly. American welders worked in organized teams, with each team assigned a specific length of hull to weld in a defined time period. Supervisors tracked progress continuously. If welding fell behind schedule, additional teams were assigned to that section. Welding equipment was standardized, allowing any welder to operate any equipment with minimal adjustment. Japanese welders, working under master craftsmen, maintained higher discretionary control over their work. Individual welders might work on different sections of hull across multiple shifts, ensuring quality through personal attention to the work. This approach produced excellent results and maintained traditional craft standards. It could not, however, match American production speed. The American welding procedures themselves had been systematized. The American Bureau of Shipping, which certified shipyard practices, had established standardized welding specifications covering joint design, electrode selection, welding technique, and inspection procedures. These standards had been developed through systematic testing and refined through thousands of hours of operational experience. Japanese shipyards maintained higher variability in welding practices, with different yards and even different sections of individual yards maintaining distinct procedures based on local experience and master craftsman preferences. This variability ensured quality but precluded the standardization that made mass production possible. The statistical comparison was stark. American shipyards in 1944 were launching approximately one Liberty ship every 4 to 6 days, on average. The Kaiser yards alone, which operated 4 separate building sites, were launching vessels at a combined rate of 1 every 2 days at peak production. The yards operated continuously, with work proceeding around the clock through 3 shift rotations. Japanese shipyards launched approximately 1 substantial merchant vessel per month on average. The discrepancy was not a temporary wartime phenomenon, or the result of insufficient effort. It reflected fundamental differences in industrial organization that could not be quickly overcome. The welding speed visible in the photographs represented only the most obvious aspect of this organizational difference. Behind the welders, elaborate supply chains had been organized to deliver materials exactly when needed. Steel plate arrived at the shipyard in standardized dimensions, ready for fabrication. Structural shapes had been prefabricated off-site and arrived ready for assembly. Electrical systems, propulsion machinery, and other complex components arrived as standardized modules that could be integrated into the hull using standardized attachment points. Japanese shipyards maintained less standardization of components. Individual vessels might have unique requirements accommodated through custom fabrication. This flexibility allowed incorporation of late design changes and accommodated the traditional approach to individual shipbuilding. It also meant that supply chains could not operate as efficiently. The workforce statistics revealed additional organizational differences. American shipyards had recruited workers from diverse backgrounds, including women, African Americans, and other groups historically excluded from skilled trades. Comprehensive training programs converted workers with no previous shipbuilding experience into competent welders, fitters, and fabricators within weeks. The American approach to worker training emphasized standardized procedures and rapid skill acquisition. Training was task-specific, focusing on the limited procedures required for the worker's assigned role rather than comprehensive craft education. A worker might specialize in a single type of weld or a specific assembly operation, repeating it hundreds of times until speed and consistency improved dramatically. Japanese shipyards relied more heavily on traditional apprenticeship and craft training. Workers spent years developing broader technical knowledge. The depth of knowledge was superior to the American approach, but the development process was slower. Japan's shipyard workforce, depleted by military conscription and disrupted by American bombing, could not be quickly expanded through rapid training programs. The capital investment in shipyard facilities reflected similar philosophical differences. American shipyards had invested enormous resources in specialized equipment for welding, material handling, and assembly. Massive welding machines that could be positioned along the hull length and operated by trained technicians replaced manually held welding equipment. Gantry cranes, designed specifically for shipyard operations, moved heavy components with precision and speed. Blast furnaces for metal preparation, automated cutting equipment for plate fabrication, and thousands of other specialized machines transformed American shipyards into factories for ship production. Japanese shipyards had made capital investments, but at a smaller scale and often later in the war. The diversion of resources to aircraft production, the focus on military shipbuilding rather than merchant vessels, and the later recognition of shipbuilding's critical importance all contributed to less comprehensive mechanization. The photographs that Tsukamoto presented to the Naval General Staff showed welders working amid this mechanized infrastructure. The speed of welding operations was enabled by this entire organizational and capital system, not simply by superior welding technique or worker effort. American welders appeared fast because they were operating within a system designed specifically to maximize production speed. The economic context underlying these organizational differences was fundamental. American shipbuilding had developed from a commercial shipbuilding industry that competed globally. American yards had to compete on price and delivery schedule against European yards. This competitive pressure drove efficiency improvements continuously. American yards had adopted mass production principles from automobile manufacturing, developing economies of scale in ship construction that historic shipbuilding had never achieved. Japanese shipbuilding had developed primarily for military purposes and historically for the protected domestic market. Japanese yards faced less competitive pressure to achieve cost and schedule efficiency. The approach that developed emphasized quality, durability, and flexibility rather than production speed. These qualities were valuable for military ship construction, but they came at the cost of production volume. The photographs showed this difference tangibly. American yards operated at industrial production line speed. Japanese yards, photographed on intelligence missions over Japan, operated at craft production speed. The disparity was not hidden or disputed. It was visible in the daily work of the shipyards. What made the December 1944 briefing significant was that Japan's highest naval leadership finally had to confront these photographs and their implications directly. Abstractions about American industrial capacity could be debated. Production statistics could be questioned or attributed to propaganda exaggeration. Photographs of American welders working at evident speed in organized teams on multiple hull sections simultaneously could not be rationalized away. The Naval General Staff listened to Tsukamoto's presentation with recognition of its significance. These were not speculative calculations or theoretical projections. The photographs represented current American industrial operations. The welding speed shown represented existing operational capability, not future potential. American shipyards were currently building vessels at rates that Japanese yards could not approach. The strategic implications cascaded logically from this industrial reality. Japan had commenced hostilities with 6 large fleet carriers and 5 smaller ones. By December 1944, Japan operated 3 large fleet carriers and a handful of smaller carriers, with several under construction. Japan had lost approximately 20 fleet and large light carriers since 1941. Most had been sunk by American carrier aircraft or surface forces. Japan had laid down replacement carriers, but only 6 had been completed since 1941. American shipyards, in the same period, had delivered 17 Essex-class fleet carriers and 9 Independence-class light carriers. Additional escort carriers by the dozens had been added to American naval strength. The production ratio was approximately 3-to-1 in America's favor in terms of fleet carriers alone, and the disparity was widening. At existing construction rates, America would possess approximately 30 to 35 fleet and large light carriers by war's end in 1945. Japan would possess perhaps 6 to 8 operational carriers. American merchant tonnage would exceed pre-war capacity substantially. Japanese merchant tonnage would have been reduced to a fraction of pre-war levels. devastated by American submarine warfare and air attacks. The photographs of American welders crystallized this reality into a single, unavoidable image. Speed of welding equaled speed of ship construction. Speed of ship construction equaled fleet replacement rate. Faster fleet replacement rate equaled strategic victory for America, regardless of tactical outcomes in individual battles. The mathematics were absolute. Admiral Toyoda, after listening to the briefing, made the stark assessment that would be recorded in classified naval records and later recovered by Allied intelligence. We have been defeated by industrial capacity. The speed at which American welders complete hull welding determines the rate at which they can replace ship losses. We cannot defeat this process through naval tactics or strategic brilliance. We can only hope to survive it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The recognition that Japan had been defeated by American industrial organization, crystallized in the visible speed of American welding operations, forced a difficult reassessment among Japan's naval leadership. Yet this reassessment could not translate into policy changes that would alter the war's trajectory. Japan's strategic options had contracted to only three possibilities, all catastrophic. First, Japan could attempt to accelerate its own shipbuilding through rapid adoption of American construction methods. This would require wholesale reorganization of Japanese shipyards, retraining of workforce, massive capital investment in new equipment, and disruption of ongoing construction. Even if accomplished with maximum efficiency, the process would require 6 to 9 months. Japan did not possess 6 to 9 months. American advances in the Pacific were accelerating. The invasion of the Philippines was underway. Second, Japan could attempt to reduce American shipyard output through direct military action. Air raids against American shipyards might be possible, but Japan's air force had been largely destroyed by this stage of the war. Japan's remaining aircraft were needed for home defense against the intensifying B-29 bombing campaign. Committing scarce aircraft to raid distant American shipyards, thousands of miles across the Pacific, was operationally impractical. Submarine attacks against American shipping and transports might temporarily disrupt operations, but American anti-submarine measures had improved dramatically since 1943. Japanese submarines could not sustain operations that would meaningfully impact American industrial output. The Battle of the Atlantic had demonstrated this reality for Germany. Japan faced comparable strategic constraints. Third, Japan could accept defeat and negotiate surrender. This option was politically unthinkable to the military leadership dominating Japanese government. The entire military ideology, the cultural emphasis on honor through continued resistance, and the fear of occupation all made surrender unacceptable to the military planners who controlled Japan's government in 1944. Japan remained trapped between recognition of inevitable defeat and inability to accept the logical consequences of that recognition. The photographs of American welders represented the final clarification of Japan's strategic position. The examination of American industrial capacity, which should have prompted realistic reassessment of war objectives, instead reinforced the determination to continue fighting despite the mathematical certainty of eventual defeat. The explanation for this apparent irrationality lay partly in institutional and cultural factors that prevented strategic adaptation. Japanese military culture emphasized continued resistance as morally superior to surrender, regardless of the strategic hopelessness of the situation. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan, suggested that spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantage. Bushido traditions emphasized honor through struggle rather than victory through survival. These cultural factors, while producing extraordinary individual acts of courage and sacrifice, prevented the kind of cold strategic calculation that might have suggested negotiation or conditional surrender before American military advances placed Japan in an even more desperate position. Japan's military leadership, particularly the army officers who held dominant political power, preferred fighting to the nation's destruction rather than accepting the diplomatic humiliation of surrender. Additionally, Many officers believed that if Japan could inflict sufficient casualties on invading American forces during the anticipated invasion of the home islands, American public opinion might force the United States government to accept a negotiated settlement. This hope was delusional, but it provided psychological justification for continuing the war despite recognition of material defeat. The examination of American welding operations in December 1944 represented the last clear opportunity for Japan's leadership to recognize that continued resistance was futile and that negotiation offered the only path to avoiding complete national devastation. Instead, the briefing strengthened determination to prepare for home island's defense and to inflict maximum casualties on American forces in hope of eventual negotiated settlement. The photographs of American welders that had been examined in December 1944 became increasingly relevant as the strategic situation deteriorated throughout 1945. The invasion of Okinawa, which began on April 1, 1945, demonstrated the inexorable advance of American forces supported by overwhelming material superiority. The battle lasted 82 days and cost approximately 50,000 American casualties and approximately 110,000 Japanese casualties, including a large number of civilian deaths. More significantly for naval planners, the battle confirmed that American logistics could sustain operations at vast distances from the home islands. American naval forces maintained continuous presence off Okinawa, supporting the land campaign with gunfire and air cover. American supply ships, built in the quantities that American shipyards produced them, maintained the flow of ammunition, food, fuel, and replacement equipment required for sustained operations. Japanese naval forces attempted to disrupt this logistics through mass kamikaze attacks and final naval sorties. The cruiser Yamato, the most powerful battleship ever built, was sent on a suicide mission to disrupt the Okinawa invasion. The ship was sunk on April 7, 1945 by American aircraft, without significantly disrupting American operations. The loss of the Yamato symbolized the futility of attempting to overcome American material superiority through tactical heroism. American shipyards were replacing the ships lost in the Okinawa campaign faster than the battles progressed. Damaged vessels were transported to rear area shipyards, where American welders, working at the speed documented in the intelligence photographs, repaired battle damage and returned ships to service. New replacement vessels, launched from American shipyards at established production rates, arrived in theater throughout the campaign. Japanese naval forces, diminished to a handful of operational vessels by the spring of 1945, faced an enemy whose industrial base generated replacement ships faster than Japan could destroy them. The photographs of American welders had captured this reality in microcosm. The speed of welding, multiplied across dozens of American shipyards operating simultaneously, created an industrial production machine that no amount of Japanese military effort could slow or stop. By May 1945, as Germany's surrender brought Soviet forces into the war against Japan, and as American bombers intensified the strategic bombing campaign against Japanese cities and industrial targets, the examination of American welding speed became almost irrelevant from an operational perspective. Japan's strategic defeat was total and acknowledged even by military leaders who refused to accept its logical conclusion. Surrender. Japan's surrender in August 1945 followed the Soviet declaration of war, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the final psychological collapse of military resistance. The surrender came not because Japan's military leadership had accepted strategic reality, but because Emperor Hirohito himself intervened to force acceptance of defeat. Even then, significant elements of the military leadership opposed surrender. The Japanese surrender on August 15, 1945 brought the war to an end, but it could not undo the strategic miscalculation that had driven Japan into conflict it could not win. The examination of American welding speed in December 1944 had crystallized what Japanese planners should have understood years earlier. America possessed industrial capacity that rendered Japanese military resistance ultimately futile. Approximately 2,800,000 Japanese military personnel died in the war. Between 500,000 and 1 million Japanese civilians perished through bombing, starvation, and combat-related causes. These casualties accumulated in a conflict that Japan's military leadership had initiated while understanding, on some level, that it lacked the industrial capacity for prolonged warfare. The post-war interrogations of Japanese military leaders revealed the extent to which they had grasped American industrial superiority while remaining psychologically unable to act on this knowledge. General Hideki Tojo, the prime minister who had driven Japan toward war, testified during his war crimes trial that Japan had fundamentally underestimated American industrial potential. "We knew the statistics," Tojo stated, "but we did not comprehend what they meant in operational terms. The Americans could replace losses faster than we could inflict them. This understanding should have guided our strategy. Instead, we clung to hope that spiritual superiority would overcome material disadvantage." Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who had commanded the combined fleet during the war's final critical phase, provided similar testimony. When confronted with the welding speed photographs and the production statistics they represented, Toyoda acknowledged that the Naval General Staff had recognized Japanese defeat as mathematically certain by late 1944. Yet recognition of defeat had not translated into policy changes. Japan had continued fighting for 8 additional months, inflicting massive casualties on both sides, knowing that victory was impossible. The explanation for this apparent contradiction between knowledge and action lay in institutional, cultural, and psychological factors that prevented realistic strategic adaptation. Japanese military ideology emphasized continued resistance as spiritually superior to negotiated settlement. The concept of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of old Japan, had been invoked throughout the war as justification for continued fighting regardless of material circumstances. Military officers who suggested surrender faced accusations of cowardice and disloyalty. Some faced actual assassination or suicide. The institutional incentives within the military hierarchy strongly discouraged realistic strategic reassessment. Those who acknowledged defeat might be blamed for the war's outcome, making surrender psychologically costly for individual leaders, even when strategically rational. Additionally, many Japanese leaders believed that the anticipated American invasion of the home islands could be made sufficiently costly that American public opinion would force negotiation. This hope was sustained despite increasing evidence that American determination to achieve unconditional surrender had only strengthened as the war progressed. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which killed approximately 130,000 people immediately, with tens of thousands dying later from radiation effects, finally shattered this hope. Only Emperor Hirohito's personal intervention, breaking with constitutional precedent, forced Japan's military leadership to accept surrender. Even then, significant elements of the military hierarchy resisted. Some military units attempted to continue fighting after the emperor's surrender broadcast. Others committed suicide rather than accept defeat. The institutional momentum of the military, once committed to absolute resistance, could not be easily reversed even by the emperor's direct command. The examination of American welding speed represented one final opportunity for strategic course correction. The photographs showed not theoretical industrial capacity, but actual operational reality. American welders working at demonstrated speed, organized in efficient teams using standardized procedures, represented the tangible mechanism by which American industrial superiority translated into military advantage. If Japan's leadership had accepted the implications of these photographs in December 1944, Japan might have opened surrender negotiations in early 1945, before the Soviet entry into the war, before the atomic bombings, and before the anticipated American invasion of the home islands. The terms available to Japan would still have been harsh, but the devastation inflicted in the final 8 months of warfare might have been avoided. Instead, recognition of defeat became another piece of evidence that Japan's military leadership compartmentalized, acknowledging intellectually while refusing to accept emotionally or strategically. The war continued. American forces advanced. Japanese cities burned under incendiary bombing. Japanese military forces died in futile resistance. American forces suffered casualties in combat that might have been avoided through earlier negotiation. The post-war analysis of Japanese strategic failure repeatedly returned to the same core issue. Japan had gambled on a short war because military planners understood that Japan could not win a long one. Yet, the gamble rested on fundamentally mistaken assumptions about American psychology, American industrial capacity, and the nature of total war in the 20th century. Japan's military strategists had projected their own cultural values and their own resource limitations onto an enemy operating under entirely different constraints. They had assumed Americans were soft, decadent, and unwilling to endure hardship. Pearl Harbor, they believed, would shock Americans into accepting Japanese hegemony in East Asia. Instead, Pearl Harbor unified American society behind total war. They had assumed American industrial capacity, while large in absolute terms, would be constrained by the need to support civilian consumption and by the political impossibility of imposing wartime privation on American civilians. Instead, American industrial output actually grew during the war years, expanding to support both massive military production and continued civilian consumption. They had assumed that if forced to fight for distant Pacific islands against determined Japanese defenders, American public opinion would eventually force their government to negotiate rather than sustain casualties in prolonged island-hopping campaigns. Instead, American casualties, while significant, never reached levels that the American public deemed unacceptable, and American industrial capacity meant that replacement equipment and personnel arrived continuously to sustain operations. Most fundamentally, they had assumed that material factors could be overcome through superior will, strategy, and tactical skill. American industrial organization, expressed in the visible speed of American welders completing hull construction, proved them catastrophically wrong. Industrial capacity, deployed at scale against opponents lacking comparable productive capability, proved decisive. The photographs of American welders that Tsukamoto examined in December 1944 captured this reality in microcosm. The images showed ordinary workers performing routine industrial tasks in an organized, systematic manner. There was nothing dramatic or heroic about the scenes. They represented the unglamorous reality of industrial mass production: standardized procedures, organized teams, continuous flow manufacturing, and relentless efficiency driving toward quantifiable production targets. These ordinary industrial processes, replicated across dozens of American shipyards operating simultaneously, created an industrial machine that Japan could not match, could not overcome, and could not survive indefinitely. The photographs represented Japanese military defeat rendered in visual form, expressed through the speed at which American workers completed welding operations. For Japanese naval officers viewing those photographs in December 1944, the psychological impact was distinct from reading production statistics. Numbers on a page could be debated, questioned, or rationalized. Photographs showing American industrial operations in action could not be so easily dismissed. The images revealed that American industrial supremacy was not theoretical or exaggerated. It was real, operational, and overwhelming. The examination of those photographs created what military psychologists would later term a reality cascade among Japan's naval leadership. The initial recognition of industrial defeat created pressure to acknowledge additional defeats that had been previously rationalized or compartmentalized. If Japan had lost industrial competition with America, then perhaps Japan had also lost the aerial competition, the naval competition, the strategic bombing competition, all the domains where American material advantage was being operationalized into military superiority. This cascade of recognitions should have prompted strategic reassessment. In some military circles, it did. Certain officers began cautiously exploring possibilities for negotiated settlement. However, these efforts were suppressed by military hardliners who maintained that continued resistance, no matter how futile, was the only honorable course. The opportunity for strategic adaptation passed. The war continued for 8 additional months after the photographs were examined. Japan's strategic situation deteriorated beyond repair. American forces established themselves on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, approaching striking distance of the Japanese home islands. American bombers intensified their assault on Japanese cities. Soviet forces defeated Japan's Kwantung Army in Manchuria in a matter of days, demonstrating the complete collapse of Japanese military capacity. By August 1945, when Japan finally accepted surrender, the nation faced complete military defeat, Soviet entry into the war, and the imminent invasion of the home islands by American forces. The terms available to Japan in August were harsher than the terms that would likely have been available in early 1945 had Japan initiated surrender negotiations following the recognition of industrial defeat in December 1944. The examination of American welding speed became one final piece of evidence, recovered after the war by Allied intelligence teams, documenting Japan's understanding of its strategic predicament. The photographs, the calculations of construction timelines, and the recognition of industrial defeat were all recorded in classified naval documents that survived the war. These documents, examined by post-war historians, revealed that Japan's military leadership had known. They had possessed the information necessary for realistic strategic reassessment. They had conducted the technical analysis. They had reached the correct conclusions about industrial capacity and its implications. Yet they had been unable or unwilling to translate this knowledge into policy changes that might have altered the war's trajectory. The gap between knowledge and action, between intellectual recognition of defeat and emotional acceptance of surrender, had proven fatal to millions of people. The story of Japan's examination of American welding speed transcends the specific narrative of industrial production or naval warfare. It represents a broader historical lesson about the relationship between material factors and strategic outcomes, about the psychological barriers to accepting unpleasant truths, and about the consequences of allowing institutional momentum and cultural ideology to override rational strategic assessment. American industrial superiority in World War II represented a form of power that was not immediately obvious, but became increasingly inescapable as the war progressed. A block of welded steel hull plate, completed in hours instead of days, multiplied across thousands of such plates, across dozens of ships, across hundreds of ships built in multiple shipyards, created a form of power that exceeded any individual act of military heroism or tactical brilliance. The photographs of American welders became, for post-war historians, a symbol of this industrial power rendered visible. The images captured ordinary workers engaged in routine industrial tasks, yet these images revealed the mechanism by which American industrial capacity had been converted into military superiority. The welders shown in the photographs were not soldiers or military personnel. They were civilian workers, performing industrial labor. Yet their work had proven as decisive to the war's outcome as any military operation. Japan's military leadership, viewing those same photographs in December 1944, had seen in the images the visual confirmation of what they had intellectually understood but emotionally resisted. Japan had already lost the war. Not through tactical defeat in individual battles, not through strategic miscalculation in specific campaigns, but through being outmatched in industrial capacity by an opponent whose productive capability exceeded Japan's by factors of 10 to 20 across most categories of military production. The recognition that Japan could not win a war of industrial attrition should have prompted immediate strategic reassessment. Instead, it prompted 8 additional months of futile resistance, millions additional casualties, and the near-total destruction of Japan's physical infrastructure. The opportunity to negotiate settlement before complete catastrophe was passed over in favor of continued fighting against mathematically certain defeat. The post-war reconstruction of Japan demonstrated, paradoxically, that the industrial capacity Japanese military leaders had sought to seize through force could be achieved more effectively through peaceful enterprise and trade. Modern Japan rebuilt its industrial base and eventually became the world's second-largest economy by the 1980s. The shipbuilding industry that Japan's naval planners had struggled to accelerate during wartime became, in the post-war decades, one of Japan's premier industrial achievements. Japanese shipyards, incorporating advanced welding techniques, automated systems, and modern manufacturing principles, became world leaders in shipbuilding and ship design. The industrial transformation that Japan could not accomplish during wartime was achieved in peacetime through different means and different purposes. The irony was profound. Japan could not beat America in wartime industrial competition, but Japan could match and eventually exceed American industrial achievement in peacetime through commerce and trade. The speed of American welders in 1944 had been decisive in defeating Japan militarily. The comparable skills of Japanese workers, applied to peacetime industrial production, became a source of national prosperity rather than military defeat. The story of Japanese admirals studying American welding speed represents, in its final analysis, a meditation on the relationship between material factors and historical outcomes. Japan's military leadership had access to information about American industrial capacity. They understood the statistical reality of American productive superiority, yet understanding information and accepting its implications proved to be two distinct processes, separated by institutional, cultural, and psychological barriers that prevented realistic strategic adaptation. The examination of American welding photographs in December 1944 should have been a moment of strategic clarity, a final opportunity to recognize that continued resistance was futile and that negotiation offered the only path to avoiding complete national devastation. Instead, the examination became another data point that Japan's military leadership compartmentalized, acknowledged without action, and buried beneath layers of institutional momentum and ideological commitment to absolute resistance. The photographs showed American workers, organized into efficient teams, working at standardized procedures, completing the industrial tasks that sustained American military power. The images were ordinary, unglamorous, devoid of drama or heroic elements, yet in their ordinariness lay extraordinary significance, the visible manifestation of industrial power that would prove decisive in determining the war's outcome, regardless of tactical victories or strategic brilliance displayed in individual campaigns. For historians examining the photographs decades after the war, they became a symbol of how material factors, often invisible in conventional military histories focused on battles and commanders, actually determine strategic outcomes. The welders in the photographs contributed more decisively to American victory than many celebrated military commanders. Their work, performed at industrial scale and tempo, created the productive capacity that rendered Japanese resistance ultimately futile. The admirals who studied those photographs in 1944 faced a choice: accept the implications and advocate for realistic strategic reassessment, or compartmentalize the knowledge and continue defending institutional commitments to continued resistance. Most chose the latter course. The choice carried consequences measured in millions of lives. The mathematics of industrial capacity, rendered visible in the speed of American welding operations, proved to be the true determinant of the Pacific War's outcome. No amount of tactical skill, strategic brilliance, or willingness to sacrifice could overcome the fundamental advantage conveyed by the ability to produce replacement ships, aircraft, and equipment faster than an opponent could destroy them. Japan's military leadership, examining the photographs in December 1944, understood this truth. Yet understanding the truth and acting on it proved to be separated by a gulf that Japan's institutional and cultural systems could not bridge. That gulf, and the failure to traverse it, became the final tragedy of Japan's experience in World War II, a tragedy written not in the speed of welders completing hull construction, but in the millions of lives lost in a war that Japan's leadership knew could not be won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.